Have you ever wondered why, after so many promises and prophecies in the Old Testament, there was a divine silence that lasted for 400 years? The mysteries of the 400 years of silence unveil hidden secrets that shaped the journey of faith and waiting for the people of Israel. Imagine living in a period where answers seem distant and biblical mysteries remain unsolved. This intertestamental period was not just a pause but a preparation for the Messiah who would transform history. In this video, we will uncover how this divine silence served as essential spiritual preparation, influencing everything from the fall of Jerusalem to the coming of John the Baptist. You will discover how Messianic promises kept hope alive in times of trial and how the transition to the New Testament was orchestrated by these years of silence. Get ready to dive into deep biblical reflections that reveal the true meaning of this interval and how it impacts our journey of faith and waiting today. Are you ready to explore the mysteries that few know and understand the trust in God's promises that sustained an entire nation? Then join us on this historical and spiritual journey, where each revelation brings us closer to understanding divine promises and the coming of John the Baptist. Don't miss the opportunity to discover how these 400 years of biblical silence shaped the faith that still inspires millions around the world. The end of the Old Testament marks the closure of an era filled with faith and challenges for the people of Israel. After the writings of Malachi, the intertestamental period began, a phase of approximately 400 years of biblical silence. This silence of God does not signify absence, but rather a time of spiritual preparation for what was to come. Imagine eagerly waiting for something as significant as the arrival of the Messiah. It is within this context that history unfolds, laden with biblical mysteries that continue to intrigue scholars and the faithful. During these centuries, Jerusalem faced the fall and domination of powerful empires such as the Persians, Greeks, and ultimately the Romans. The conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonians had already left deep scars, and the subsequent foreign domination brought significant cultural and religious changes. The absence of new prophets and canonical writings during this period fueled the sense that the Messianic promises were in limbo, heightening the anxiety and hope of the people for a divinely prepared leader. In this period of silence, the prophecies of the Old Testament continued to echo in the minds and hearts of the Jews. The history between Malachi and Matthew is marked by an incessant wait for the promised Messiah. The Messianic promises were not forgotten. On the contrary, they became even more central to the faith and identity of the people. This journey of faith and waiting required unwavering trust in God's promises, even when the answer seemed distant. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD to Roman forces symbolized not only the end of a physical temple, but also the transition to a new religious and political landscape. Roman domination brought a new order, profoundly influencing daily life and religious practice. In this environment, the preparation for the Messiah took various forms, from religious movements to cultural adaptations that sought to keep hope alive in times of trial. The absence of new prophets during these 400 intertestamental years created a spiritual vacuum that was filled by other forms of leadership and teaching. Synagogues, for example, became centers of worship and study, where spiritual preparation was constant. This preparation was not merely theoretical. It involved daily practices of faith and resistance, keeping the flame of hope alive for the coming of John the Baptist and, subsequently, Jesus Christ. The empires that dominated the region left their marks not only politically but also culturally. Hellenism, for example, brought the Greek language and influenced Jewish customs and traditions. The translation of the Septuagint was a significant milestone, making the scriptures accessible to a broader audience and facilitating the dissemination of the Bible's spiritual lessons. This cultural exchange, though challenging, also paved the way for the transition to the New Testament. God's silence during this period can be seen as a form of spiritual preparation for the people. Without new prophetic revelations, the community had the opportunity to strengthen its faith and perseverance. This time of waiting was crucial for consolidating trust in God's promises, even in the face of adversity and uncertainty. Reflecting on the meaning of God's silence invites us to consider how moments of apparent stagnation can be essential for spiritual growth. Roman influence was not limited to political domination. It also impacted the religious landscape. The imposition of new laws and the presence of a dominant culture challenged Jewish traditions, creating an environment of internal conflict between maintaining identity and adapting to new influences. This context of tension and adaptation was fundamental for shaping the beliefs and practices that would be essential in the transition to the New Testament. During these 400 years, the spiritual preparation of the people of Israel involved not only passive waiting but also concrete actions to strengthen faith. Reading the scriptures, practicing rituals, and participating in faith communities were ways to keep hope and trust in God's promises alive. This preparation was essential for the coming of John the Baptist, who would play a crucial role in breaking God's silence and preparing for the arrival of the Messiah. The journey of faith and waiting during the intertestamental period is a profound lesson in trust and perseverance. Even in the face of God's silence and the adversities imposed by dominant empires, the people of Israel maintained their hope. This history teaches us that in times of trial, trusting in God's promises and engaging in spiritual preparation are fundamental to facing challenges and awaiting the fulfillment of divine promises. The Messianic promises of the Old Testament are like stars shining in the night sky of Jewish faith, guiding the people of Israel through centuries of uncertainty. These prophecies, filled with hope and expectation, outlined the arrival of a divinely appointed leader who would bring redemption and renewal. In the intertestamental period, the 400 years of biblical silence intensified the anxiety and faith of the people, who eagerly awaited the fulfillment of these messianic promises. The history between Malachi and Matthew is permeated by this longing, reflecting a journey of faith and waiting that deeply resonates in the spiritual lessons of the Bible. During this long interval, the people of Israel faced the challenge of keeping hope alive for the coming of the Messiah, even in the face of God's silence. The prophecies of the Old Testament, such as those of Isaiah and Jeremiah, continue to be studied and reinterpreted, keeping the flame of expectation burning. This wait was not passive. It involved continuous spiritual preparation, where trust in God's promises was strengthened even in times of trial. Trusting in God's promises was the anchor that kept faith firm, even when circumstances seemed desolate. The absence of new prophets during these 400 years created a void that was filled by the constant reminder of the messianic promises. The people of Israel found comfort in the Scriptures, revisiting the prophecies of the Old Testament and meditating on the meaning of God's silence. This deep reflection allowed them to develop a richer and more nuanced understanding of the divine promises, spiritually preparing themselves for the coming of John the Baptist and, subsequently, Jesus Christ. Spiritual preparation was not merely an act of waiting but an active building of faith and resilience. The importance of faith and perseverance during this period of waiting cannot be underestimated. Each day that passed without the fulfillment of the messianic promises was an opportunity to strengthen the journey of faith and waiting. The Jewish community united in practices of worship, study, and solidarity, reinforcing trust in God's promises. This perseverance was essential to keep hope alive, even when God's silence seemed prolonged. Hope in times of trial became a powerful testimony of the people's unwavering faith. The messianic promises also served as a constant reminder of future hope, motivating concrete actions of spiritual preparation. Reading and meditating on the Scriptures were daily practices that strengthened faith and kept the focus on the fulfillment of divine promises. Additionally, participation in synagogues and faith communities provided a sense of belonging and mutual support, essential for sustaining trust in God's promises. This spiritual preparation was an active response to God's silence, transforming the wait into a time of growth and strengthening. The expectation for the coming of the Messiah profoundly influenced the daily life and religious practices of the people of Israel. Festivities and rituals were imbued with messianic significance, reflecting the constant hope in the realization of divine promises. This integration of faith with daily life helped keep hope alive, even in the face of adversities and cultural changes imposed by dominant empires. Spiritual preparation manifested not only in acts of devotion but also in attitudes of resilience and hope. The history between Malachi and Matthew is a rich narrative of unfulfilled promises and a faith that persists despite appearances. Each revisited messianic prophecy during this period reinforced the confidence in the coming of the Messiah, fueling the hope and expectation of the people of Israel. This history is a testament to the trust in God's promises and the importance of spiritual preparation in times of silence and waiting. Trusting in God's promises was the light that guided the journey of faith and waiting, illuminating the path to the fulfillment of divine promises. The journey of faith during the 400 years of biblical silence is a profound lesson on the importance of perseverance and trust in God's promises. Even when God's silence seemed prolonged, the faith of the people of Israel remained unshakable, sustained by the prophecies of the Old Testament and the hope in the coming of the Messiah. This unwavering trust in God's promises is an inspiration for all of us, reminding us of the importance of maintaining faith and hope even in times of uncertainty and trial. Spiritual preparation during this period was multifaceted, involving not only the reading and meditation of the Scriptures, but also the practice of acts of kindness and justice. Trusting in God's promises was manifested in concrete actions of love and solidarity, reflecting the essence of the messianic promises. This comprehensive spiritual preparation not only strengthened individual faith, but also consolidated the community as a whole, united by hope and trust in divine promises. The cultural influence of the dominant empires also played a crucial role in maintaining hope for the coming of the Messiah. The translation of the Septuagint, for example, made the scriptures accessible to a broader audience, facilitating the dissemination of Messianic prophecies and the spiritual lessons of the Bible. This cultural exchange, despite adversities, contributed to spiritual preparation and the transition to the New Testament, paving the way for the coming of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. The cultural influence of the empires, far from extinguishing hope, transformed and strengthened it, preparing the path for the realization of divine promises. The transition from the intertestamental period to the New Testament did not occur in a cultural vacuum. During the 400 years of biblical silence, the influence of Greek culture and, subsequently, the Roman Empire profoundly shaped the life and beliefs of the Jewish people. This cultural influence not only altered customs and daily practices, but also paved the way for the dissemination of the Bible's spiritual lessons. The interaction between Hellenistic culture and Jewish traditions created a dynamic environment where spiritual preparation for the coming of the Messiah could flourish in unexpected ways. Hellenism, with its emphasis on philosophy, arts, and science, brought a new perspective to Jewish thought. The introduction of the Greek language facilitated communication and the exchange of ideas among different peoples and cultures. This linguistic unification was crucial for the translation of the Septuagint, which made the writings of the Old Testament accessible to a broader audience. The Septuagint not only preserved biblical mysteries but also allowed Messianic prophecies to be understood and debated within a wider cultural context, spiritually preparing the people for future revelations. In addition to language, Greek customs and practices influenced the daily life of Jews. The adoption of certain Hellenistic practices coexisted with Jewish traditions, creating a synergy that enriched the spiritual experience. For example, Stoic philosophy, which emphasized virtue and reason, found resonance in the spiritual lessons of the Bible, promoting a deeper and more reflective spiritual preparation. This cultural interaction enabled Jewish faith to adapt and resist external pressures, keeping hope alive for the coming of the Messiah. With the rise of the Roman Empire, cultural influence became even more pronounced. Roman domination brought new laws, political structures, and a widely disseminated culture that directly impacted the religious and social landscape of Judea. The imposition of centralized authority and the presence of a Roman administration created an environment of tension and resistance, where trust in God's promises became even more essential. Preparation for the Messiah in this context involved not only the maintenance of religious traditions, but also the adaptation to new political and cultural realities. The impact of Roman domination was also reflected in the architecture and infrastructure of the region. The construction of Roman roads facilitated the dissemination of ideas and messianic promises, making travel and communication between different parts of the empire easier. This network of roads not only connected cities but also symbolized the transition to a new era of cultural and spiritual interconnectedness. The spread of Old Testament prophecies was aided by this infrastructure, allowing the Bible's spiritual lessons to reach a broader and more diverse audience. The Greco-Roman cultural influence also manifested in the arts and literature. Hellenistic literature, with its complex narratives and multifaceted characters, offered new means for expressing the Bible's spiritual lessons. Stories of courage, faith, and perseverance found parallels in Greek epics and tragedies, creating a bridge between Jewish tradition and the dominant culture. This cultural integration not only enriched the spiritual experience but also prepared the people for the transition to the New Testament, where these influences would become even more evident. The translation of the Septuagint was a significant milestone in the spiritual preparation for the coming of the Messiah. By making the scriptures available in Greek, the Septuagint allowed messianic prophecies to be understood within a broader cultural context, facilitating the transition to the Christian era. This translation not only preserved biblical mysteries but also enabled the Bible's spiritual lessons to be debated and interpreted in ways that resonated with Greco-Roman cultural influences. Spiritual preparation, therefore, involved not only passive waiting but also active adaptation to cultural changes. Roman domination, with its emphasis on order and efficiency, also impacted the organization of Jewish communities. Synagogues, already centers of worship and teaching, became even more important as spaces of cultural resistance and spiritual preparation. In these synagogues, the Bible's spiritual lessons were taught and debated, reinforcing trust in God's promises and spiritually preparing the people for the arrival of John the Baptist and, subsequently, Jesus Christ. Spiritual preparation, in this sense, was intrinsically linked to maintaining cultural and religious identity in the face of external pressures. The Greco-Roman cultural influence also contributed to the development of new forms of theological and philosophical thought within Judaism. Interaction with external philosophical ideas stimulated deep reflections on the nature of God, faith, and hope. These reflections enriched the Bible's spiritual lessons, offering new perspectives on messianic promises and the meaning of God's silence during the intertestamental period. Spiritual preparation, therefore, involved not only the preservation of traditions but also the incorporation of new ideas that strengthened the people's faith and hope. Finally, Greco-Roman cultural influence paved the way for the transition to the New Testament. Linguistic unification, political changes, and new forms of cultural expression facilitated the dissemination of the gospel and the spiritual lessons of Jesus Christ. Trust in God's promises and hope in times of trial, cultivated during the 400 years of biblical silence, were fundamental for the reception of the messages of John the Baptist and Jesus. This spiritual preparation, shaped by cultural influences, ensured that the transition to the New Testament was not only possible but also profoundly impactful for faith and human history. The 400 years of biblical silence were not merely a temporal interval but also a period of intense religious and social activity for the people of Israel. In this context, significant religious movements emerged, such as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who played crucial roles in the spiritual preparation for the coming of the Messiah. These groups, although distinct in their beliefs and practices, shared the same hope in the messianic promises and the transition to the New Testament. The history between Malachi and Matthew is enriched by the presence of these movements, which contributed to the trust in God's promises and the spiritual preparation of the people. The Pharisees emerged as a group dedicated to the rigorous interpretation of the Torah and oral traditions, seeking to apply the prophecies of the Old Testament to daily practices. They were known for their emphasis on ritual purity and meticulous observance of religious laws, reflecting continuous spiritual preparation and trust in the messianic promises. The influence of the Pharisees was felt not only in the synagogues but also in daily life, where their practices and teachings helped keep the hope alive for the coming of the Messiah. This dedication to spiritual preparation was a direct response to God's silence, transforming the wait into an opportunity to strengthen faith and perseverance. On the other hand, the Sadducees represented a more aristocratic and conservative faction, focused on maintaining established social and religious structures. They rejected the Pharisees' oral traditions and adhered strictly to the written texts of the Torah, reflecting a more literal interpretation of the messianic promises. The absence of new prophets and canonical writings during this intertestamental period created a conducive environment for the strengthening of groups like the Sadducees, who sought to preserve the cultural and religious identity of the people of Israel. Trust in God's promises, even in the face of silence, was central to the formation and maintenance of these religious movements. The evolution of the synagogue system during this period was a crucial factor in consolidating the Pharisaic and Sadducean movements. Synagogues, already established as centers of worship and teaching, became meeting points where the Bible's spiritual lessons were debated and reinterpreted in light of messianic promises. This evolution reflected the importance of continuous spiritual preparation, where trust in God's promises was strengthened through study and communal practice. Thus, the synagogue was not only a place of worship but also a space of cultural and spiritual resistance, where hope for the coming of the Messiah was kept alive. The internal conflict between tradition and new cultural influences also played a significant role in the emergence and evolution of the Pharisees and Sadducees. While the Pharisees were more open to adaptations and interpretations of traditions in light of Hellenistic influences, the Sadducees remained firmly anchored in ancient practices and laws. This tension reflected the complexity of spiritual preparation during the 400 years of biblical silence, where trust in God's promises coexisted with the need for cultural and social adaptation. The interaction between these groups helped shape the religious identity of the people of Israel, spiritually preparing the ground for the transition to the New Testament. The importance of faith and perseverance was evident in both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, albeit in different ways. The Pharisees, with their emphasis on oral tradition and continuous interpretation of the Scriptures, demonstrated a dynamic and adaptive faith, ready to respond to emerging spiritual needs. In contrast, the Sadducees, with their more conservative approach, represented a stable faith resistant to cultural changes, maintaining trust in the messianic promises through the preservation of ancient laws. Both movements, despite their differences, reflected a journey of faith and waiting that was central to the spiritual preparation of the people of Israel. The interaction between the Pharisees and the Sadducees also contributed to an environment of theological and intellectual debate, where the Bible's spiritual lessons were constantly re-evaluated and deepened. These debates not only strengthened trust in God's promises, but also allowed for a richer and more multifaceted understanding of the Messianic prophecies. Spiritual preparation, therefore, involved not only religious practices but also a profound intellectual engagement with the Scriptures and traditions, promoting a journey of faith and waiting that was both personal and communal. The influence of these religious movements extended beyond the synagogues, affecting the daily life and social practices of the people of Israel. The Pharisees, for example, were known for their dedication to community service and charity, reflecting the Messianic promises of redemption and renewal. Meanwhile, the Sadducees, with their focus on aristocratic leadership, influenced political and social structures, ensuring that spiritual preparation was aligned with the maintenance of order and tradition. This interaction between faith and society was fundamental to the trust in God's promises and to the continuous spiritual preparation. The spiritual preparation promoted by the Pharisees and Sadducees also involved education and the teaching of the Scriptures, ensuring that the Bible's spiritual lessons were passed down from generation to generation. This focus on education reflected the importance of continuous spiritual preparation, where trust in God's promises was strengthened through knowledge and understanding of the Messianic prophecies. Reading and studying the Scriptures were daily practices that kept hope alive for the coming of the Messiah, even during periods of silence and trial. The influence of the Pharisees and Sadducees in the spiritual preparation for the coming of the Messiah cannot be underestimated. These religious movements, with their distinct approaches, contributed to the formation of a resilient and adaptive religious identity, ready to face the challenges and uncertainties of the intertestamental period. Trust in God's promises, reflected in the practices and beliefs of these groups, was essential to keep hope alive in the transition to the New Testament and in the fulfillment of the Messianic promises. The journey of faith and waiting during the 400 years of biblical silence, influenced by the emergence of the Pharisees and Sadducees, is a profound lesson on the importance of diverse thought and cultural adaptation in spiritual preparation. Even in the face of God's silence, trust in divine promises manifested in various ways, reflecting the richness and complexity of the spiritual preparation of the people of Israel. This history teaches us that trust in God's promises and spiritual preparation are fundamental to facing challenges and waiting for the fulfillment of divine promises, regardless of external adversities. God's silence during the 400 intertestamental years is one of the Bible's most intriguing and profound mysteries. This period of biblical silence, far from being mere divine absence, carries significant purpose in the divine plan. Imagine being in a long wait, where answers seem distant and the silence deafening. It is in this setting that the spiritual preparation of the people of Israel took shape. The journey of faith and waiting during this time reflects an unwavering trust in the Messianic promises, even when God's silence seemed prolonged. Why did God remain silent for these centuries? Many scholars and theologians believe that this silence was essential for the spiritual preparation of the people. Without new revelations or prophecies, the community had the opportunity to strengthen its faith and deepen its understanding of the divine promises. This intertestamental period allowed the Israelites to reflect on the spiritual lessons of the Bible, cultivating a spiritual preparation that would be crucial for the coming of John the Baptist and, subsequently, Jesus Christ. Trusting in God's promises became even more vital, serving as an anchor in times of uncertainty and trial. The importance of this period in the divine plan cannot be underestimated. God's silence functioned as a time of refinement, where the people's faith was tested and strengthened. This active waiting allowed the Messianic promises to be internalized and hope to remain alive, even in the face of adversity. The history between Malachi and Matthew is a testament to this continuous spiritual preparation, where trust in God's promises withstood the test of time and challenging circumstances. Reflecting on the meaning of God's silence invites us to consider how moments of apparent stagnation can be essential for spiritual growth. Just as the earth needs time to produce fruit, faith also requires periods of waiting and preparation. This silence provided the people of Israel the opportunity to develop a deeper and more resilient relationship with God, reinforcing trust in the divine promises and spiritually preparing the way for the fulfillment of the Messianic prophecies. Additionally, God's silence encouraged a more intense search for understanding and wisdom. Without new revelations, religious leaders and the community as a whole turned to the existing scriptures, revisiting and reinterpreting the Old Testament prophecies. This practice of study and reflection deepened the understanding of the Messianic promises and the Bible's spiritual lessons, promoting a spiritual preparation aligned with trust in God's promises. Continuous reading and meditation on the Scriptures became essential pillars for keeping hope alive during this period of silence. Spiritual preparation during the 400 years of biblical silence also involved more intense practices of devotion and worship. Without the constant presence of prophets or new revelations, the community turned to deeper forms of connection with God, strengthening their faith through rituals, prayers, and celebrations. These practices not only kept hope alive, but also fostered a trust in God's promises that transcended external circumstances. Spiritual preparation, therefore, was both an active response and a manifestation of trust in divine promises. Reflecting on how God's silence can be a form of spiritual preparation offers valuable lessons for today. In moments of silence or apparent absence of answers, trusting in God's promises and continuous spiritual preparation remain essential. This unwavering trust, cultivated during the 400 years of biblical silence, serves as a model for facing the uncertainties and trials of modern life. Hope in times of trial, fueled by trust in God's promises, continues to be a powerful source of strength and resilience. Furthermore, God's silence highlighted the importance of community in spiritual preparation. During this period, unity and solidarity within the Jewish community were fundamental to keeping hope alive. Trusting in God's promises was not just an individual journey but a collective experience, where each community member contributed to the common spiritual preparation. This interconnectedness strengthened the people's faith and perseverance, spiritually preparing the ground for the transition to the New Testament. The profound biblical reflections that emerged during God's silence also enriched the understanding of the Messianic promises. The absence of new revelations allowed the ancient prophecies to be examined in new lights, revealing layers of meaning that might not have been fully understood otherwise. This depth of understanding promoted a more complete and nuanced spiritual preparation, aligned with trust in God's promises and ready for the coming of the promised Messiah. Finally, the journey of faith and waiting during the period of biblical silence is a lesson on the importance of trust and perseverance. Even in the face of God's silence and the adversities imposed by dominant empires, the people of Israel kept hope alive, demonstrating an unwavering trust in divine promises. This history teaches us that in times of trial, trusting in God's promises and spiritual preparation are fundamental to facing challenges and awaiting the fulfillment of divine promises. The prophetic landscape that preceded the coming of the Messiah is a complex mosaic of historical, cultural, and spiritual factors that paved the way for a profound transformation. During the 400 years of biblical silence, the prophecies of the Old Testament continued to resonate, guiding the spiritual preparation of the people of Israel and influencing the global context. This period not only consolidated the Messianic promises but also created the ideal conditions for the coming of John the Baptist and, ultimately, Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah. The linguistic unification provided by Hellenism, especially through the Greek language, played a crucial role in the dissemination of Messianic prophecies. The translation of the Septuagint made the scriptures accessible to a broader audience, allowing the promises of the Old Testament to reach beyond Jewish borders. This translation not only preserved biblical mysteries but also facilitated the understanding of the Bible's spiritual lessons in a diverse cultural context, spiritually preparing the world for the transition to the New Testament. Roman roads, with their efficiency and reach, symbolized a network of connections that facilitated the dissemination of ideas and messianic promises. These communication routes enabled the Gospels to spread rapidly, connecting different communities and cultures. The Roman infrastructure not only made it easier for preachers like John the Baptist and Jesus to travel, but also symbolized the transition to a new era of cultural and spiritual interconnectedness, where God's promises could be fulfilled more broadly and effectively. The cultural dissemination promoted by the Roman Empire also influenced the way prophecies were interpreted and applied. Interaction with different cultures and philosophies stimulated deeper reflections on the messianic promises and the meaning of God's silence. This cultural exchange allowed the Bible's spiritual lessons to be adapted and reinterpreted, enriching the understanding of divine promises and spiritually preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah. Spiritual preparation, therefore, involved not only the maintenance of traditions but also the incorporation of new perspectives that strengthen hope in God's promises. The prophecies of the Old Testament played a fundamental role in the spiritual preparation for the coming of the Messiah. Texts like Isaiah 40 verse 3, which speaks of the voice crying in the wilderness, and Jeremiah 31 verses 31 to 34, which announces a new covenant, became essential reference points for messianic expectation. These prophecies not only fueled hope but also provided a spiritual roadmap for preparation, guiding the people of Israel and, later, the early Christians in understanding and accepting divine promises. The reading and meditation of these prophecies became daily practices that kept hope and trust in God's promises alive. Spiritual preparation also involved the formation of faith communities that reflected messianic promises. Synagogues, as centers of worship and teaching, played a crucial role in spiritual education and the dissemination of prophecies. In these communities, the Bible's spiritual lessons were debated and applied to daily life, strengthening trust in God's promises and spiritually preparing the people for the arrival of the Messiah. Community cohesion, fueled by trust in God's promises, was essential to keep hope alive during periods of silence and trial. Trust in God's promises was reinforced by the constant expectation of the coming of John the Baptist, who would prepare the way for Jesus. John the Baptist, as the forerunner of the Messiah, played a crucial role in the world's spiritual preparation. His message of repentance and baptism resonated deeply, aligning with Messianic prophecies and spiritually preparing the people for the coming of Jesus. The coming of John the Baptist was a significant milestone in the transition to the New Testament, symbolizing the beginning of the fulfillment of divine promises and the breaking of God's silence. Hope in times of trial was kept alive by spiritual practices and messianic promises that continued to inspire the people of Israel. Trust in God's promises, even in the face of adversities imposed by dominant empires, reflected a resilient faith that was essential for spiritual preparation. This unwavering trust in divine promises not only sustained hope during the 400 years of silence, but also spiritually prepared the way for the fulfillment of messianic promises, strengthening the people's faith and perseverance. The Bible's spiritual lessons, drawn from messianic prophecies, provided practical guidance for spiritual preparation. Continuous reading of the scriptures, the practice of prayer, and participation in faith communities were fundamental to keeping hope and trust in God's promises alive. These practices not only strengthened individual faith but also consolidated collective trust in messianic promises, spiritually preparing the ground for the coming of the Messiah. Spiritual preparation, therefore, was a combination of individual and collective practice, aligned with trust in God's promises. The transition to the New Testament was facilitated by the spiritual preparation undertaken during the 400 years of biblical silence. Trust in messianic promises, fueled by the Old Testament prophecies, created a receptive environment for the coming of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. This spiritual preparation involved not only the maintenance of religious traditions, but also the adaptation to cultural and social changes promoted by Hellenism and Roman domination. Trust in God's promises, strengthened by spiritual preparation, ensured that the transition to the New Testament was received with faith and hope, spiritually preparing the world for the fulfillment of divine promises. Finally, the prophetic landscape that prepared the world for the Messiah is a story of trust, hope, and continuous spiritual preparation. The Old Testament prophecies, combined with the cultural influence and spiritual preparation of the people of Israel, created the ideal conditions for the coming of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. This spiritual preparation, grounded in trust in God's promises and the Bible's spiritual lessons, was essential for the fulfillment of messianic promises and the transition to the New Testament. The history between Malachi and Matthew is, therefore, a rich narrative of faith and spiritual preparation, reflecting trust in God's promises and hope in the fulfillment of divine promises. The arrival of John the Baptist marks the end of the 400 years of biblical silence and the beginning of a new era in the world's spiritual history. John, as the voice crying out in the wilderness, broke God's silence with a message of repentance and preparation for the coming of the Messiah. His mission was intrinsically linked to the messianic promises of the Old Testament, serving as a vital link between the history from Malachi to Matthew. The spiritual preparation that John promoted was fundamental for the transition to the New Testament, bringing hope in times of trial and renewing trust in God's promises. John the Baptist emerged in a period of great expectation and tension. The people of Israel, after centuries of divine silence, longed for concrete signs of the Messiah's coming. John, with his preaching in the wilderness, offered exactly that, a call to spiritual purification and faith renewal. His message resonated deeply, fueling the journey of faith and waiting that had been cultivated during the years of silence. The coming of John the Baptist was, therefore, not only the fulfillment of a prophecy but also the beginning of a more intense and focused spiritual preparation for the arrival of Jesus, the promised Messiah. The connection between Malachi and the announcement of the kingdom of heaven is evident in John the Baptist's mission. Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, had prepared the ground for the Messiah through his prophecies, highlighting the need for a messenger who would come before the Lord. John the Baptist assumed this role with determination, preaching the imminent arrival of the kingdom of heaven and preparing the way for Jesus. This transition symbolizes trust in God's promises, even after a long period of silence, and reinforces hope in the fulfillment of the messianic promises. John the Baptist's message was clear and direct: repentance and baptism for the remission of sins. This call to spiritual purification reflected the Bible's spiritual lessons, encouraging people to prepare for the Messiah's coming. The practice of baptism, beyond being a symbol of renewal, represented a concrete action of spiritual preparation, aligned with trust in God's promises. Therefore, John not only announced the coming of the Messiah but also provided a practical means for people to spiritually prepare for this transformative event. John the Baptist's influence extended beyond the borders of Israel, impacting various communities and cultures. His preaching about repentance and spiritual preparation resonated in different contexts, facilitating the dissemination of messianic promises in a global setting. The spiritual preparation promoted by John was essential for the transition to the New Testament, where the Bible's spiritual lessons would be widely disseminated and applied. The coming of John the Baptist, therefore, was a significant milestone in the journey of faith and waiting, spiritually preparing the world for the fulfillment of divine promises. John the Baptist also played a crucial role in the spiritual preparation of religious leaders and future authorities of the Christian faith. His interaction with figures like Jesus and his disciples established the foundations for understanding the Messianic promises and the Bible's spiritual lessons. Trust in God's promises, reinforced by John's presence, was fundamental for the formation of the early Christian communities and the spread of the gospel. This spiritual preparation, facilitated by John, ensured that divine promises were understood and accepted by a new generation of believers. The spiritual preparation promoted by John the Baptist also involved creating an environment conducive to divine revelation. His austere lifestyle and dedication to the Messianic mission inspired many to follow his example of faith and perseverance. Trust in God's promises was evident in every aspect of his life, from his baptism to his willingness to face adversity in the name of truth. This dedication exemplified the Bible's spiritual lessons, encouraging others to maintain hope and trust in divine promises, even in times of silence and trial. The coming of John the Baptist was a clear sign of the end of God's silence and the beginning of a new era of revelation and fulfillment of Messianic promises. His mission spiritually prepared the people for Jesus' arrival, establishing a solid foundation of faith and hope. The transition to the New Testament was facilitated by trust in God's promises, fueled by the Bible's spiritual lessons and continuous preparation during the years of silence. John, as the forerunner of the Messiah, symbolized the renewal of faith and hope in times of trial, reinforcing the importance of spiritual preparation for the fulfillment of divine promises. The history from Malachi to Matthew, enriched by the arrival of John the Baptist, is a narrative of trust and continuous spiritual preparation. John not only announced the coming of the Messiah but also exemplified trust in God's promises through his actions and teachings. His mission was a direct response to God's silence, transforming the wait into an opportunity to strengthen the people's faith and perseverance. The spiritual preparation promoted by John was essential for the transition to the New Testament, ensuring that the Messianic promises were fulfilled and that trust in God's promises remained unshakable. Finally, the arrival of John the Baptist and the beginning of a new era represent the culmination of 400 years of biblical silence and the fulfillment of the Old Testament's Messianic promises. John, as the Messiah's forerunner, played a vital role in the world's spiritual preparation, establishing the foundations for the transition to the New Testament. Trust in God's promises, reinforced by John's mission, ensured that the journey of faith and waiting culminated in the coming of Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah. This story of spiritual preparation, trust in divine promises, and hope in times of trial continues to inspire and guide the faith of millions around the world. We've reached the end of this journey through the mysteries of the 400 years of biblical silence, a period filled with deep biblical reflections and spiritual preparation. But the true transformation begins now, with you. Have you ever stopped to think about how trusting in God's promises can impact your own journey of faith and waiting? What lessons can you apply in your daily life to strengthen your spiritual preparation and maintain hope in times of trial? Imagine being able to use the teachings we've explored to face current challenges with the same perseverance and faith as the people of Israel. Perhaps it's time to revisit the prophecies of the Old Testament, meditate on the meaning of God's silence in your life, or even engage more actively in your faith community, just as the Pharisees and Sadducees did. What concrete actions can you take today to renew your trust in God's promises and spiritually prepare yourself for the challenges ahead? If these reflections have touched your heart and you feel ready to take the next step in your journey of faith and waiting, I invite you to act now. Share in the comments how you plan to apply these lessons in your life and inspire others to do the same. Your story could be the spark someone needs to renew their own faith and hope. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue exploring biblical mysteries together and discover more spiritual lessons from the Bible that can transform your life. Together, let's deepen our trust in God's promises and live a spiritual preparation that makes a difference in the world around us. Let's build a strong and resilient faith community, ready to face any challenge with hope and perseverance.